Looking back on the conflicts that I've been involved with, either as a journalist or in fact the first one I was involved with in the Middle East was in Kuwait and southern Iraq in 1991 when I was a young infantry lieutenant. But since then, most of the major interventions or attempts to change regime I've been involved with as a journalist. And the one thing which makes me extremely concerned with this is that unlike in some other conflicts where there's been a successful regime change, there is no effective armed opposition or coherent political opposition waiting to replace the regime. So it looks like a recipe for chaos to start with.
Remember the Times produced an acclaimed podcast, a really, really good podcast called Last Man Standing. It followed our war correspondent Anthony Loyd's strenuous efforts to uncover the fate of John Cantlie, the British photojournalist who was kidnapped by ISIS in Syria in 2012. The BBC is now releasing a TV documentary series featuring Anthony that builds on his work on the podcast, and the Times has announced a new series of Last Man Standing to be released tomorrow. So we get to talk to Anthony Loyd about that, and also about everything else that's going on in the world, because we want to waste an opportunity to talk to Anthony, great man that he is, and he's with us in the studio. Anthony, morning to you.
Good morning.
Let's talk about John Cantlie then. Why do we not know what happened to him? This has been going on for almost 15 years.
So there are a number of reasons, and let me just recap. John's story was fascinating and needed to be told. It hadn't been told in full until our podcast managed to answer many of the questions around him. But just to go back, John Cantlie was a British photojournalist. He was kidnapped, first of all, in Syria in 2012 by a radical group of largely foreign jihadis. He managed to escape. He was rescued. He came back and broke the most amazing story, which came out in the Sunday Times. He described his capture by, as I say, foreign jihadis, including amongst them many Brits, about a dozen Brits, and an NHS doctor. His testimony became the crucial part of a terror trial. The doctor had been arrested on his return to the UK. Meantime, John was abducted a second time in Syria. This time he didn't emerge from captivity. He managed to survive for 4 years, longer than any other of about 22 Western hostages, until finally he was last seen in Mosul during the climatic battle between the Iraqi army, Islamic State, and British and American special forces. So this was a story which really needed to be told. There were a lot of questions around John. Some people said that his survival was based on the fact he'd become a propaganda asset for Islamic State, which was true, he had. But had he really turned, as some of the establishment suggested, or was he just embarking on a desperate gamble to survive? What actually happened to him? No one was quite sure. These were just some of the big questions around John. We managed to answer most of those questions in the podcast. It was difficult because there was a Foreign Office inspired news blackout around much of John's fate. For a time it was believed he could still be alive and that any reporting on him might endanger his life. He's now it's accepted that he's dead and that he died in Mosul. So it is easier to speak to some people and to answer many of those questions. And the BBC have done their documentary version now of the podcast and taken it a bit further as well.
And you've got a new podcast series coming out tomorrow about this. I mean, is it important to clear his name? Not quite clear his name. Is his reputation important to you, Anthony? That actually
Yes, it is. It is, and I feel really strongly about this. So there were 22 Western hostages. All of the European hostages were released for ransom. That left 7 American and British hostages. All of the American and British hostages, whose country had a policy of non-payment of ransom, were murdered by Islamic State, apart from John. Now, in death, the other hostages at least were allowed the grace of some peace, of some public recognition, and of some grief. But in John's case, these questions around him that filled the kind of silence of the news blackout led to a lot of suspicion and doubt, suggestions that he had turned, that actually had sort of drunk the Islamic State Kool-Aid. And those questions kind of grew, and he never had, even when a tree was planted in his memory in the Al-Nouri Mosque with a little tag to it saying this is in memory of John Cantlie, the tree had to be removed. Certainly the tag did, because local Iraqis were like, we don't know whether this guy came to our city with the soul of a hostage, as they said to me, or the soul of a terrorist. So there were these questions about him. And he occupies a very central place in the story of journalists and how they reported on that war in Syria, which was a terrible war. to report on. Very, very dangerous, very violent. And so I think it's absolutely right that at this time his story is examined and retold as it has been.
Well, I can't wait to hear the podcast. The first one was absolutely superb, so I'm grateful that you're doing another one. You're here now, Anthony, but you've been around the Middle East an awful long time reporting on conflicts. There have been conflicts for the last, what are we now, 20 years, 30 years? I mean, there have been conflicts for hundreds of years, but I'm thinking specifically of the last couple of decades. We now have a new one or a new version of the old one happening now. Where do you think this is going? Where does this tend, this decision by America and Israel to go after Iran in another way? Where does this lead us?
Well, looking back on the conflicts that I've been involved with, either as a journalist or in fact the first one I was involved with in the Middle East was in Kuwait and southern Iraq in 1991 when I was a young infantry lieutenant. But since then, most of the major interventions or attempts to change regime I've been involved with as a journalist. And the one thing which makes me extremely concerned with this is that unlike in some other conflicts where there's been a successful regime change, there is no effective armed opposition or coherent political opposition waiting to replace the regime. So it looks like a recipe for chaos to start with. There are four possible outcomes which, in loose order. One which I think would be very difficult to achieve would be, as America wants, it seems, so far as one can discern what they want, a popular uprising which leads to the replacement of the regime with a kind of benign government that hands over the 440 kilograms of highly enriched uranium and gives America lots of kind of oil rights. I think that's very unlikely to happen. Then, alternatively, you could get a regime replacement with a regime that's still repressive but more amenable to America's wishes, hands over the highly enriched uranium. You can get the regime surviving. I would say that's not unlikely. The current regime somehow weathers and endures.
Maybe through the second son, Khamenei's son.
Maybe Khamenei's son. We've still got a long time to go on this, I would guess. Or worst case scenario, you get the country imploding into civil war with competing revolutionary groups trying to get hold of the highly enriched uranium, which is the scenario which nobody wants. It's perhaps not the most likely, but it's certainly not impossible. So very high stakes. And in the absence of a clear plan or a coherent opposition force or political grouping to take over, it's very difficult to see how this would end well.
And the idea of regime change from the air. We talked to Ali Ansari, who's a professor in Iranian history, and he made the point that if you can degrade the regime's military to a large extent, you at least make it harder for them to fight back. But the problem that you've just raised, and I think many have raised, is if the opposition don't have weapons at all, even the reduction in the weapons that the regime possess probably won't be enough because they won't have anything to fight whatever they have with.
Absolutely. I think that the Libya scenario is quite a good one to reflect on, in that there were some armed opposition groups in Libya. They were quite small pre-Gaddafi's downfall. Around the time of his downfall, they kind of loosely coalesced, but never really got it together. And in Libya, 2011, Gaddafi was overthrown. Well, Libya is still somewhat of a failed state. There's still violence that's never come together. And the scenario could be much worse in Iran. It's very difficult to see where it's going at the moment. Nowhere good, I would imagine.
No. And I had a feeling you might say that, but it has force when you do say it. Great to speak to you. Thank you for coming to the studio.
Thank you.
There's Anthony Loyd there. And the podcast is called Last Man Standing. You can listen to the first one, and then the next one is released tomorrow.